The 60s were a time when, in Canada, the social tensions between various groups became increasingly acute. And the social tensions between the English and French was the most dramatic. It was called the Quiet Revolution at first, and then later on it ceased to be so quiet. I was a kind of middle manager in Toronto in 1970, 71, 70. I was in charge of programs for the network on the arts and sciences. It was an interesting job. And I had no reason to be unhappy. But when the CBC asked me whether I was interested in becoming a regional director of English programming in radio and television in Quebec, I thought it over and then I accepted with some pleasure because I liked Montreal. I found the tensions and the cultural turmoil in which Quebec was deeply involved. I found that interesting. And it was time for a change. I also must confess, I liked the idea of having some authority, what I thought was authority, because I was no longer a producer, and I was in the kind of career path. And if one is a parish priest, one wants to be pope, or at least cardinal. And the idea of becoming a cardinal in Quebec it was rather a nice idea for me, I thought. Okay. So in 1971, after a rather terrible event, namely the October crisis, in which a cabinet minister was murdered, and it was really the major crisis that led to later on to the rise of a separatist leader, and René Lévesque, who became the premier of the province while I was there, the leader of the party while I was there. So I lived through this whole revolution. And as you can imagine, there was a newsroom and there were programs that had to deal with all this every day. It was a time of some considerable agitation, importance, significance, difficulty. And my position was that of like a English ambassador at the French court. That's how I always thought of it. And it was primarily diplomatic. I had to protect, maintain the interests of the English stations, the English language broadcasting in radio and television. And this was not easy because all the facilities and the personnel, the technical personnel, were under the control of the French network, not the English network. So whatever I could win, I could only win through diplomacy. I had no divisions at my back. I could not impose sanctions. Whatever I could do, I could. Now it so happened that the French colleagues with whom I had to deal were, without exception, extremely receptive to me and nice to me. And especially their boss, Raymond David, who was a very, very, very interesting character, whom I had known before. He had been in educational programming, and our interests were very much the same. He was a literary character, and he, as a matter of fact, after he had retired, he did a lot of acting on the stage. And I think he was always acting, but the part he was acting was one of a charismatic leader. And he had everybody liked him, and it was a great pleasure to deal with him. And I must confess, I had a better time with the French than with the English. My French was not very good. My French was barely good enough, especially since I had to attend so many meetings, and I had learned French in a German school. I'd never lived in France, or never, and when I lived in Quebec before, I never spoke French, or very little French. So my French was all right, but not very good. And I often felt that I could understand everything that was said to me, but I always missed the point. And I think that was true, but I learned how to bluff my way through all this. As I say, I had a better time with the French than with the English, because the English, especially one of my bosses, after some years and out of the blue, very unpleasantly, criticized me and thought that my style or my way, that I had made too many concessions to the French, and that I was protecting people who were not competent, and I was extremely upset, especially since it was a surprise. Nobody had ever said a word to me about this. It came out of the blue. And I thought it was grossly unfair, and I think I still do. And I defended myself. I wrote a strong memo and then we had a long conversation, and my antagonist kind of yielded to me and didn't apologize, but I thought he caved in, and it was never referred to again. But I never forgot it. And I should add something else that is of interest, and that is of political interest. In 1976, René Lévesque, whom I just mentioned, became premier. And there was another very attractive French politician, French personality, whom I had known before. René Lévesque and I had been colleagues in the international service in the 1950s, early 50s, and late 40s. He and I, for example, of all things, covered a royal tour together in 1952, I think, across the country. And I saw, and they had a photograph of him and me saying goodbye to, I think at that time it was Princess Elizabeth and Prince, what's his name, Philip. So he was very, that was a royal situation in which we found ourselves. And later on, he became the great leader of a separatist party, the Parti Québécois. And the CBC is a federal institution. The separatists, their program was to separate from the Federation and to make some kind of a new deal. So you can imagine that, since I was in the middle of all this, that this was a very tense time. The newsroom, which is a very important institution in any broadcasting setup, the French newsroom was full of crypto-separatists, people who supported the rebel government, but their bosses, of course, this had to be dealt with great care, CBC management, I thought, on the top level, handled this with great subtlety and tried very hard to manage the situation without a witch hunt. However, the newsroom and the bosses and the government and everybody knew that the newsroom was what they considered full of unreliable people. This was really a French problem, and not an English problem. But I was in the middle of it, and in the cafeteria and in the corridors and everywhere, this was the subject, and I must say it was very interesting, and I can't remember any incident or anything which made this difficult for me or unpleasant for me, or that a political situation arose which I couldn't handle. It didn't happen. So it was all very smooth, but when the occasion arose for me to go back to Toronto, I took it with pleasure and a little bit of relief. And I returned to Toronto. I spent one more year in Toronto as a kind of junior ombudsman in my old department of public affairs. And when the chance came for me, when the moment I hit the age of 60, I took the opportunity and retired from the CBC in order to begin a new career.